I smell oil. Let's be clear, this is not an engine rebuilding tutorial. In fact, the bulk of this motor's insides are like new-ish. You see, I reconditioned this 2.25 litre motor about 10,000 kilometres back. Rebored, new pistons, bearings, skimmed head, block, hardened valve seats, runs mint. But I did cheap out in a couple of places, like not replacing the rocker shaft, knowing that I could get at that later. Plus, it spent a couple of years next to the beach, so anything exposed could do with a freshen. A little sediment. I should probably empty this more often. Now look, I know this seems like a giant can of worms, and you're right to think that. Months have passed since this shot. But for those of you patiently following along, rest assured, as you're watching this, she's all buttoned up and ready to fire. I've pulled the head off. You can see she's a little crusty on the inside. I probably wouldn't have bothered removing the head and just left this to clean up over time if it wasn't for the fact that half of the head bolts need to come out anyway to change the rocker shaft. This carbon buildup is caused by too rich a fuel mixture, or perhaps oil being introduced to the intake. We should have dealt with any mixture issues in the carburetor rebuild. The end result of this amount of buildup is that the engine can run on for a few strokes after you turn it off. This can even cause puffing, like backfiring, out through the carb, which is at the start of the engine. So maybe that's a front fire. The crud gets really hot. Well, obviously it gets hot. Stupid thing to say, it's literally in constant explosion. Anyway, what happens is that the crud can stay glowing red for a while, and that ignites the fuel coming in, just like a spark plug. You can see I'm pretty careful about cleaning the block to make sure no crud drops below the pistons. You can see I'm placing the head back on, but this is only temporarily resting in place. I'm going to redress this motor, including a fresh coat of paint, and having as much of the engine together as possible saves a lot of masking. I'm using a basic enamel paint. Now before you Land Rover maniacs get into debating duck egg blue, baby battleship, whatever engine colours, this paint here was colour matched to an original untouched piece of the motor last time I had it apart. So I'm pretty confident that whatever colour this is matches the tin of paint Land Rover had floating around when this motor rolled out of the factory. In saying that, please feel free to unleash your correct paint codes into the comments section below. That's the paint dealt with. Let's commence the rebuild. But before we get into that, for the sake of the non-engine guys, let's briefly explain what's going on here. This is the engine block assembly. Contains 4 pistons. This guy here is the front of the crankshaft sticking out. You can see the crankshaft is connected via a chain to a gear. The gear is the end of our camshaft. Thus, the chain is our timing chain because it keeps the crankshaft and camshaft rotating in time with each other. This is the back end of the camshaft. See that cam-shaped lobe? There are 8 in total, 1 for each exhaust valve and 1 for each intake valve. So if I stick a bit of leverage onto the crankshaft and turn the engine over, you can see obviously the piston's moving and the cam's turning. You can see the cam lobe lifting a tappet, which would open a valve if the head was in place, either letting fuel in or exhaust out. And if I swing the engine upside down, you can see the crankshaft turning as the pistons move in and out. And that's it. Apart from Teslas and Wankel engines, that's how every combustion engine in every car works. Only small details differ. Enough faffing about. Let's get something done. Remember that seeping oil stain? Yeah, that'll be the rear main seal leaking. Land Rover's 3-component seal design isn't the most foolproof. I mean, it's an excellent design solution. That's if you like oil all over the fuck. Apparently, there are heroic people who can change this seal with the motor in the vehicle, lying on their back in the mud, after shimmying the gearbox back. I call BS. You'd need ninja fingers and monk-like patience. If you can prove me wrong, I'll give you a minute right now to share your story in the comments. With the rear bearing cap removed, you can see the crankshaft part of the seal, which just sort of rests against this rim. And on the side of the cap, you can see the other part of the seal, the T-shaped rubber bungs. There is a split in this one. That may be the source of the leak. Blame the moron who installed it. Here are 2 new seals. You can see where they sit once installed. Please excuse the plasters and gloved hand. I was bit by the drill press helicopter. If you buy a seal kit, you get a set of the rubber tees. The cork versions must be for an older motor. And the main seal, which is just like a typical lipped oil seal, only half cut in half. And these rubber-lined caps are the 3rd component. I'm putting the old ones back on because they look fine. Okay, I forgot to order new ones. And this is the part I can't believe anyone can do from the underside of the car. The split seal contains a spring, and that spring has to be latched together after it has been wrapped around the crankshaft. Maximum care is needed to not stretch or kink the spring, and you're working in a small gap. Once the spring is in place, it's just a case of sliding the rubber seal over and then levering the spring into the seal lip. There's a bit more technique involved if you want it to actually seal, but again, this is a laugh at me video, not a how-to video. All of the nitty-gritty is in the green manual. Now, if you thought the round oil seal looked maximum annoying, you're wrong. The T-seals are where shit gets real. Coming from someone who has tried both methods before, take the time to make tapered guide blocks. I think the Haynes manual suggests you can use an old feeler gauge to guide the seals past the sharp edge of the block, but it's a crap method. If you want to get the seals in place in one piece, make up a couple of guide blocks. These are just a couple of chunks of 10mm thick steel, with a smooth taper filed into the edge, where the seals need to squeeze into the block. The pieces are bolted down so that the lower edge of the taper ever so slightly overhangs the edge of the block. You can see where the seals have stretched and are now sticking out. This is normal and obviously needs to be trimmed, but I'll leave it for a couple of days so that the seals can settle first. You know that when the head of your engine is sitting on the workbench, you're a long way away from a finished project. So let's get this engine closed up. It's making me nervous. I haven't done anything fancy to prepare the surfaces, except scrape over them with a razor blade and clean them with turps. In the case of these motors, the head gasket goes in dry. The bolts will be torqued down properly when the rocker shaft goes back in. The push rods go in next. I know this is basic for a lot of you guys, but push rods are literally just sticks that transfer the lifting of the camshaft up to the valves. Now for the rocker shaft. All a rocker does is transfer the upwards pushing of a push rod into downwards pushing on a valve. The rocker shaft needs replacing. Last time I had the motor apart, this was the one thing I didn't do, for no reason other than being cheap. You can see there is significant wear in the shaft. This isn't a major problem, it just causes a tappy tap sound when the engine is idling. So anyway, I bought a new shaft and I'll replace the bushings in the rockers as well. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as pushing the old bushings out and pressing new ones in. Sure, that's part of the process, but the bushings aren't supplied to a finished size. They have to be cut to size after they are pressed into the rockers. So I'll need a 13.5mm reamer. It's a bit tough to ream a short, big hole to size by hand. The reamer tends to want to cut triangles instead. So the setup here is that the machined face of the rocker is used to put the rocker in square, and it's clamped in the vise fairly loosely, so that the reamer can follow the hole. And I think this is a fine method, if you don't have a better setup. Just order a few spare bushings, because this might happen. The bushings are bimetal, steel on the outside with bronze inner linings. This is the last one I reamed, and you can see we went through the bronze into the steel, which is obviously no good. This was 1 out of 8, the rest were okay. I think probably I just got lazy with the setup. The bushings are only a couple of bucks each, and I think 7 out of 8 came out fine, so I'd be comfortable using this method if I didn't have access to better machines and just order a few spares. But in this case, because they are so cheap, I decided to try again and redid all 8 with a different technique. The best way to do this would be to set things up on a milling machine and just ream an accurate hole perfectly on centre. But that's not an option available to me, so what I've done is turned a blank with as near as I can the same inner diameter as the rockers. The plan being to press each bushing into this dummy rocker that I can hold perfectly concentric on the lathe, and then cut the inside of the bushings to a slide fit. Now, I could just run the reamer through like this, but I'm not sure my tailstock is perfectly on centre, and this reamer is large enough that it'll definitely cut oversize if there's any error. So I was going to bore them instead, but that'd be way more work, so I thought bugger it. Let's try it with the reamer first. and that actually worked out perfect. So I'll run with that for the other 8. One interesting little mechanical side note. See this little hole? This is the oil feed for the rocker shaft, and in turn, everything else below it. So if the right holes don't line up, the top half of the motor is toast. The right bracket must feed the rocker shaft and line up with this hole in the block. Oh, and this is the slightly annoying way cool kids move the rocker shaft around. The head can now be torqued down properly. I do this in 2 passes. Every manufacturer publishes a specific sequence for this, which I followed. But it's basically starting from the inside out, which is important, otherwise the head can warp. The last thing that needs fixing is the front oil seal. Well, actually the oil seal is easy to change. But there's supposed to be a mud deflector thing on the outside, which will be missing on a lot of old motors, like mine. You see, Land Rover installed the mud shield with rivets, and normally the rivet heads have long been ground off, like this one, because that has to happen in order to get the mud shield out of the way to change the oil seal, and you're supposed to reinstall it with self-tapping screws. But since it doesn't really do anything, most people just leave it off completely. But we may as well go the extra mile and reinstall a new shield. The rivet holes are just under the drill size for M4, so I'll drill and tap for that size. And something I didn't really think about, there's no room for the head of a normal M4 hex. So I put Phillips head screws in instead. I pity the future fool that has to try and remove 8 crusty Phillips head screws. With that, the timing cover can be reinstalled, and that's all of the major engine parts back together.